Hello and welcome to Stupid Ancient History, Stupid Exam Skills, and today we're looking at the 20-mark essay that's at the very end of the depth study section of the exam paper. Now, before we begin, we should have a little disclaimer. The advice here is not the only way to approach these questions. These are certainly not strictly specified by the exam board. What these are a collection of techniques and tricks and hints that have worked quite well for students in the past. If your teacher gives you different advice, the golden rule is always follow your own teacher's advice, not just some weirdo on the internet. And all the examples given in this video are from the specimen exam papers and the example answers found on the OCR Ancient History GCSE website. And let's start with where to find this little question. It's not a little question. It's right at the very end of the depth studies, the very last question of the exam paper. I mean, obviously, make sure you are looking at the right depth study for what you've studied. The examples we're going to look at only look at Alexander the Great and Cleopatra and Rome. Sorry if these are not the units you've studied, but it's fair to say the technique that applies to these two depth studies apply to all depth studies, regardless of which one you've been taught. So let's start with what the question does want and what doesn't it want. And again, unusually, I've put an extract from the mark scheme up here. Again, not because I think mark schemes for GCSE Ancient History can be particularly useful if you're faced with writing them. They can be vague and difficult at the best of time. But the key thing is to point out that whilst this may seem like a straightforward essay, there's a massive but. And this is, if you look on the mark allocations, half of the marks are attributed to AO3, the use and analysis of ancient source material. It does clearly state this as a separate bit on the bottom of the question, but this is going to be where people are going to accidentally lose most marks. Bear in mind, this is the last question you will write in an hour and 45 minutes. By the time you get to this question, your brain is basically going to be in a bin or pleading with you for a swift and imminent death because it's been through an awful lot. So the key thing to remember here is you've got to think about the nature of the sources. You've got to think about your historians and your authors. And even if the question doesn't necessarily seem to lend itself to that, you've got to make sure you frame your answers around what the source says. And it could even be to the extent of, rather than starting a paragraph with one reason why, you could start with Plutarch tells us that, or Arrian tells us that, or Paterculus tells us that. Start name dropping your sources almost from the outset. Just think about how you're framing your argument. Now, it may be that on the day of your actual exam, you end up being lucky because some of the questions they've posed for these 20-mark questions have been framed directly around the presentation of the source. It may be something to do with you will never get a full picture, full understanding of Alexander the Great because of the lack of sources, or you will never get a good representation of Cleopatra or even Hannibal if you're doing the Hannibal paper because the sources are Roman. So you may look out like that, but if you don't, you've got to make sure, you've got to be prepared to start talking about authors and sources wherever possible. Again, you've got to consider how the sources present the individual. Again, given that the depth studies tend to focus on key events or key people who are usually quite controversial, that should give you reasonable grounds to start an evaluation. Certainly if it's one of the named people that the depth study focuses around, Alexander, Cleopatra, Hannibal and so on, they can be considered quite controversial, and you should, when you get to the exam, have a good idea about which authors have different things to say about them. But other than that, yes, you do have to present a balanced response. This is one of the key things they're looking for. You've got to consider what they're asking and the counter argument. It's worth pointing out as well, for this question, you'll notice on the question paper and here, there's a cheeky little star next to the question. That effectively means they are going to evaluate you, they're going to mark you on the quality of your written argument, the quality of your written answer. So again, make sure you've got clear points, clear paragraph structures, introduction, conclusion, all of the standard good writing practice that by this point, hopefully, you are well equipped with. And the final thing to point out, it's only 20 minutes. So you can't write necessarily the lengthiest or most detailed response you would ever write. It's slightly shorter than the long question for the period study, but not by much. It does still warrant a plan, so you can argue, you can organise your ideas, but when you do a plan as well, do consider how you're going to work in the sources, but being wary of time. So let's have a look at an example. We'll start with Alexander the Great, and the question is, Alexander's successes depended entirely on his Macedonian army. How far do you agree with this view? So again, straight after that, you've got that little statement, well, it's not a little statement, that statement about use and analyse ancient sources you have studied. But let's be honest, at the end of an hour and 45-minute exam, you're not going to be reading that bit as closely as possibly you should, because you'll be worrying about what the actual question's asking you. But you do need to think about the sources. So, as we can see, there's a bit of a general plan on the screen now, if you were to answer this. It's not terribly detailed, because I'm not here to give you the answers, it's more about the idea. So what you can see, I've not included the introduction in the plan, just for clarity, but you can hopefully see there's a balanced response. Alexander's successes depended entirely on his Macedonian army. So on the agree side, the Macedonian army side, there's various things you could look at. It could, and again, if you've not done Alexander, hopefully you can see a similar pattern in the kind of things you've studied. So we could look at the makeup of his army, the idea, the fact that they had these 18-foot pikes really helped. They were well trained and they knew what they were doing. You can talk about their success in battle. One thing Alexander the Great is most famous for is his very swift conquering of the Persian Empire. And how was he able to do this? Macedonian army. The other thing you could tag into this idea of the success of the his success in the Macedonian army was his generals. It wasn't just him. He was surrounded by some very skilled, very experienced men who knew what they were doing. These were full-time professional soldiers, and they had a leadership structure that absolutely relied on this well-trained, well-oiled machine. You could even argue the point that, you know, you could put anyone in charge of the Macedonian army at this point and they would have still been successful. Let's face it, Alexander spends most of the battlefield running off straight after Darius, doing his Alexander being awesome thing. Then if we look at the counter-argument, we've got other points to pick up on. I mean, the course is called Alexander the Great, so if it's not the Macedonian army, you can absolutely talk about Alexander himself. Where we're going back to relying on the sources, this is a really, really easy one to talk about. There is some absolute adulation from some authors about Alexander. He is portrayed as this tactical military genius. It's bordering on man crush in some of the sources. So this gives us an obvious point to say, yeah, Alexander, absolutely, it was down to him. However, we've got to be careful because the sources over-exaggerate his or overemphasize his particular role. We could talk about the weakness of the Persian army and how that contributed to Alexander's successes. Again, you would point out that the histories are written by the Greeks and they've just won, so maybe they are going to downplay the Persian army. I mean, let's face it, they always have done. You could look at things that disagree with the argument that the army was entirely his main thing, because they revolt later on, and again, look at how the sources portray them, and even his use of Persian rulers to control his empire. So that's, again, you're looking at an issue that's not to do with the Macedonian army. It's a counter to the argument they give. But again, if you look And then you need to come to a judgment. Again, where we've seen in the past answers that don't necessarily meet the top mark criteria, it's where they've not directly addressed the issue of how far. And you need to make sure you're doing that in the judgment. How far do you agree? You've got to have an opinion. Again, on this little plan though, you can see I've pointed out some of the areas where it's one thing to have a plan about the content you're going to write, but wherever possible, try and link that again to the sources. You may not necessarily be able to link it to every single point. And similarly, for 20 minutes, you wouldn't necessarily write about every point that's on this plan. You'd maybe choose one or two for either side. You could write a very good answer based on the Macedonian army were very important. Look how well they're portrayed in battle. And on the other hand, it was all down to Alexander. Look how the sources portray him. But the key thing is to offer the balanced judgment, include the sources, and address the issue of how far. And normally this is where I'd show you a sample answer, but I'm not gonna. It's not because I'm being lazy. There is a degree that the sample answers for this section, they are quite lengthy. They wouldn't necessarily fit on the screen as easily as you would hope. They are available on the OCR website, but realistically, for these larger questions, this is where you really need to demonstrate your skill at balancing arguments and writing essays. This is ultimately where your teachers are worth their weight in gold, by giving you the kind of feedback on any essays you write. This is why we do practice exam questions. These are guides, remember, they are not going to give you the answers for everything. But if you're using these structures and if you're using that plan, you should be able to, even after watching this, be able to construct a reasonably good answer. And then the rest is polishing. And onto a Cleopatra example. So here we go, again from the sample material. To what extent do you agree Cleopatra's downfall was caused by her relationship with Mark Antony? Again, little star next to the question, quality of written argument. Then that caveat phrase underneath that, let's face it, no one reads in the heat of the exam because you're too busy worrying about Cleopatra's relationship with Mark Antony. Same kind of deal as Alexander. We're looking for a balanced response. It was the relationship with Antony that was a downfall, or then there were other things that also led to a downfall. Again, some of the things we've said with the Alexander question absolutely apply to here. Both Cleopatra and Mark Antony are quite controversial characters, certainly if we're to believe everything the sources say. So you've got tons of room, tons and tons of room to start evaluating how they are portrayed in the sources. Again, don't forget, it doesn't have to be negative. So we've got, again, a fairly brief plan. So we start with the relationship with Mark Antony, with that caveat of how the authors portray this relationship. This is a relatively straightforward argument, a relatively straightforward question that the exam board could ask in terms of this side, the idea that she pins her hopes on Mark Antony, who she sees will be the kind of future ruler of Rome, the next Julius Caesar. Effectively, she chooses poorly because, as we all know, it's Octavian who becomes the next ruler of Rome, and by attaching herself to Mark Antony and helping him quite aggressively take on Octavian, she's shooting herself in the foot. Again, 20 minutes, you'd want one or two kind of key examples of this. Little things that aggravate Octavian are a good one. Donations of Alexandria is a really key point. By the time she sided with Mark Antony and gone for that, you know, the writing was on the wall for those two. There was no way Octavian was going to roll back from that. That side of the argument's relatively straightforward, and you'll find that with these questions, that they'll ask you the obvious, and what they're looking for is, well, how do you adapt beyond the obvious, and how do you counter that argument? So again, I've done a little bit more on this side because it's a little more elusive from the actual question. How would we counter this, that it wasn't just the relationship? So we could look at the context of Egypt and its decline from a great power to effectively being a vassal of Rome. You'll notice I've not put anything about the sources on there because that's the kind of thing where it's still a valid argument, but it doesn't necessarily give you room to evaluate the sources. You could do, but it'd be trickier, especially under the time pressure that you've got. You could talk about, well, it wasn't just her linking with Mark Antony that was a problem. You could also point to the fact that it was Cleopatra herself, the fact that she was a female ruler from a foreign country. So you can talk about Roman attitudes towards this, that didn't matter who she sided with, the Romans were always going to be suspicious of her and not particularly friendly towards her. That gives you tons of room to run with the kind of portrayal of women, and particularly Cleopatra within the sources. You could also say as well it was Cleopatra's own desire for power that ultimately led to her downfall, that she wasn't just going to be happy sitting back and ruling Egypt as a vassal state of Rome. Her desire for something bigger ultimately made her the architect of her own downfall. And again, in some of the sources, you see how we're talking about how she is portrayed, which gives you room to evaluate the nature of who is writing this. You know, this idea that a lot of the sources do have this pro-Roman, pro-Julio-Claudian angle to them. Again, you wouldn't have to necessarily talk about all three of those in 20 minutes. I choose one, maybe two good things to write about, and then make sure you include your source evaluation. If, before you come to your judgment, if, and this applies to any of the depth studies really, if you get to a point where you've written two sides of an argument but have completely forgotten to include your source evaluation, which does happen, and it happens more often than you'd think, if you get to that point, there is no harm, if you've completely forgotten to evaluate the sources, there is no harm in including a separate paragraph, if you have time, where you evaluate the question, but through the idea, you simply evaluate the sources and how they link to the question. You may not get full marks, it may not necessarily feed directly into your evaluation, but as long as you're including some consideration of how the nature of the sources will affect any answer on these individuals or on this issue, if you're including AO3, an examiner has to credit it, unless it's completely irrelevant or completely inaccurate. As long as it's some way tied to what is being asked, you will get marked for it. And then you do your judgment. And once again, I'm not giving you a sample answer. Sorry. As I've said before, now this is where you do the hard legwork, I'm afraid. There are some sample answers on the OCR website, but with these questions particularly, because there is no set or expected response, one sample answer may take you down a route that you're not sure of. It's ultimately how you respond to this question and how you improve your essay writing technique. This is where the big payoff of all that hard work comes. This video will help guide you, hopefully, but I'm not giving you the answers because, to quote the exam board, no set answer is expected. So, to summarise, this is going to be a hard question. It's the last question after an hour and 45 minutes, by which time your brain is going to be tired, which is equally harsh because, again, as we said, with the little star, you are going to be partly assessed on the quality of your argument. Remember, it's 20 minutes, it's an essay, you've got to present a balanced response in order to effectively address that issue of how far. You're going to have to pick very specific, you're going to have to pick some key specific examples to show your detailed knowledge. You can't write about everything that you possibly would do in the time given. Because don't forget, the key thing that people slip up on and that people miss, you need to consider how the sources portray the individual or event or issue that's being asked. Even if you completely forget until the last minute and just chuck a paragraph in addressing AO3, the use of ancient sources, and make sure it does link to the question. You absolutely need to do this. Effectively, half the marks are worth this. The exam board will always say that even though specific assessment objectives are given mark allocations, the examiners look at this holistically. If you're not including any reference to the sources, you're effectively not going to get above level 2 or 3. So do include a balanced argument, do include reference to the sources and evaluation of the sources, and do come to a judgment. These are asking you to take a side, come up with an opinion. What's your gut feeling on this? Don't just leave the judgment till the very end, but make sure at the end you do clearly address the issue of how far. So there you have it. There's our quick look at a 20-mark essay question found on the depth study of the GCSE paper. Hopefully you found this useful. As always, leave us a comment below, and until next time, goodbye.